The card reader beeped green, and the teller's face changed, and that was the exact second I knew my uncle had no idea what he'd actually done. I run trust compliance for a regional bank, which means my whole job is watching money move where it isn't supposed to move and asking questions until somebody has to answer them. 3 weeks earlier, my uncle had stood in my dead mother's kitchen and told me that $130,000 of her jewelry was already spent, and that family doesn't send family an invoice. He said it the way you'd tell someone you'd borrowed a lawnmower. He was wrong about the invoice part. He was about to find that out. My name is Alina Marsh. I'm 34, and for most of my life, I was the person who smoothed things over so nobody else had to. My mother used to call me her vending machine, half joke, half warning. Put a little guilt in, get a check out. I didn't understand it as a description of a wound until years after she said it. I understood it as a compliment. The wound has a second half, one nobody in my family ever named out loud, but everyone used anyway. If I got small enough, quiet enough, agreeable enough, the room stayed calm. I'd been making myself smaller since I was 9 years old. It worked, right up until it very much didn't. My mother died 14 months ago. In her will, she left me 3 things, by name: her wedding band, her mother's sapphire pendant, and a ring my father gave her the year before he passed. A ring I used to hold up to the light on Sunday mornings and watch it throw blue across the ceiling. Appraised together, 11 months before any of this happened, at $130,000. Not because they were flashy, because they were old and rare and hers. My Uncle Gary was named executor. My mother trusted him because he was her brother, and because trust, in our family, was inherited, like a piece of furniture nobody ever reupholstered. He held the jewelry in a safe deposit box until probate closed, which is a normal thing an executor says, and which I believed, because believing people was the job I'd been trained for since childhood. 6 weeks before his daughter Chloe's wedding, my uncle stopped returning my calls about the closing date. I told myself he was busy. Grief makes you generous with other people's excuses. Then his wife Patricia posted a photograph, a marquee tent strung with hanging orchids, a signature cocktail named after Chloe, a string quartet booked for cocktail hour. The caption said something about a wedding worthy of the bride. The math didn't need much work. Gary's landscaping business had been underwater for 2 years. I knew that the way you know things about family you'd rather not know. I told him. I asked him, evenly, where the jewelry was. That's when he stood in my dead mother's kitchen, the one I hadn't been able to sell yet because I couldn't stand in it long enough to call a realtor, and told me it was already spent. "You'll get over it," he said. "It was just sitting in a box anyway. Your mother would want Chloe to have a beautiful day." He said my mother's name like a coupon he was cashing. I didn't argue. I ordered a glass of water I didn't drink, and I let him keep talking, because the version of me that existed before that morning would have cried, or begged, or reminded him what those rings meant. That version was still in the room with him, but another version of me was already elsewhere, already quiet, already doing the thing I do every day at work when someone tells me a number that doesn't add up. I was already building the file. If you've ever watched someone spend what was never theirs and smile while they did it, you already know exactly how this ends. I want to walk you through how I got there, because the tools I used weren't dramatic. They were boring. They were the same tools I use every single day at a desk with fluorescent lighting, and they were more than enough. 2 weeks before the wedding, I drove past the venue for the first time, just to see it, the way you press on a bruise to check if it's still there. The gate was flanked by 2 stone pillars strung with fairy lights that hadn't been switched on yet, and a chalkboard sign leaning against one of them already read, "Chloe and Marcus Whitfield." It wasn't the same Marcus, just a coincidence of names, but it stopped my breath for a second anyway. I remembered taking that same road with my mother 11 years earlier, the 2 of us driving out to look at venues for a wedding that never happened. mine to a man I didn't marry, and her telling me that day that whatever ring I ended up wearing, she wanted her mother's sapphire on my hand at the ceremony, not tucked away in a box for safekeeping. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years. I thought about it every day for the 3 weeks that followed. The invitation to the wedding never came, which told me almost everything about how this was going to go. What came instead, 4 days after the kitchen conversation, was a text message from my cousin Chloe to a bridesmaid group chat I wasn't supposed to be able to see, forwarded to me by a bridesmaid who'd been a friend since middle school and who thought I deserved to know what was being said about me behind closed doors. Chloe had written, "My dad handled it. Don't worry about Elena. She'll come around. She always does." She always does. 3 words that told me my whole family had a working theory about who I was, and the theory had never once considered that I might stop. I drove to my mother's house that weekend, the one still smelling faintly of her hand cream in the hallway closet, because I needed to sit somewhere that remembered her honestly. I sat at her kitchen table with a box of paperwork I hadn't touched since the funeral, the will, the appraisal report from Whitfield and Cole Jewelers, photographs of each piece taken the day the appraiser came. I remembered him lifting the sapphire pendant to the window, the same way I used to hold up the ring, and saying, quietly, that pieces like this rarely leave a family unless something has gone wrong. Something had gone wrong. I drove to the wedding venue 2 days later, not for the ceremony, but because the venue coordinator had emailed me by mistake, a vendor list meant for Patricia. The email chain sat under a subject line about linen swatches and champagne flutes, ordinary and small, and buried 3 replies down was one line item that stopped me cold, a payment description reading, "Heirloom consignment, balance due." I looked up the name from my car in the parking lot, engine still running, the smell of the venue's fresh-cut lawn drifting through the vents. A consignment jeweler 40 minutes from my mother's house, the kind of shop that buys estate pieces quietly and resells them without asking too many questions about where they came from.
My grandmother, Ruth, called me that same week, before I'd told anyone what I'd found. She was 81 and had never once in my whole life taken a side in a family argument out loud. This time she did. She told me Gary had asked her for a loan the year before, using almost the same phrase he'd use on me later. Family takes care of family. And that she'd said no because something about the way he asked had felt rehearsed. She said it quietly, like she was handing me something fragile. It wasn't proof of anything by itself, but it told me this wasn't a single bad decision made under wedding pressure. It was a pattern, and I'd just found the second data point. The young man behind the counter had a name tag that said Marcus. He had the tired, careful eyes of someone who spent a few years learning exactly how much to say to strangers. I told him the truth, that I thought some jewelry belonging to my late mother had come through his store without the right person's signature on it. He didn't confirm anything. He just slid a clipboard toward me, told me the consignment intake forms were public record if a rightful owner ever needed them through the shop's attorney, and said, very quietly, that he'd grown up watching his own mother get talked out of things that were legally hers. He said it like he already knew which side of this I was on. I filed the request that afternoon. 3 days later, the forms arrived. My uncle's signature, my mother's rings and pendant, itemized, sold for $61,000, a fraction of their appraised value, because a man in a hurry to fund a wedding doesn't negotiate, he just needs the number today. $61,000 of 130. My uncle hadn't just taken what wasn't his, he'd taken it for less than half of what it was worth, because the only math he did was how fast he could get it. That was the discovery. From there, the plan wasn't complicated. It just had to be exact. There's a version of this story where I show up at the wedding and scream. I understand why people want that version. I am not that version, and I never was, not even that day in the kitchen when every part of me wanted to be. What I learned sitting with those consignment forms in my mother's kitchen wasn't a plan for revenge. It was smaller than that, and truer. I learned that being the vending machine had never been about being generous. It had been about being convenient, and convenient people don't get invited to weddings. They get informed of them afterwards, the way you'd inform an appliance that its filter needs changing. I'd spent my whole life confusing being needed with being valued. Those consignment forms weren't proof my uncle was a thief. I already knew that. They were proof I didn't have to keep being available to people who only wanted my absence to be quiet. I decided that whatever happened next, it would happen on my terms, in daylight, with paper behind every word.
I called a probate attorney the following Monday, a woman named Priya Shah, who'd handled 2 estate disputes for coworkers of mine and who listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, which is rarer than it should be. She explained that specific bequests, named items left to a named person, don't belong to the estate once probate opens, and an executor selling them without the beneficiary's authorization isn't a gray area, it's conversion, possibly theft depending on the county attorney's appetite. She also told me something I hadn't considered. Because the consignment sale went through a licensed dealer, there was a paper trail, a bonded trail, that could be frozen fast if we moved before the wedding, not after. I also started seeing a therapist twice a month that spring, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Alan Reyes, who asked me, in our 3rd session, why I'd waited 3 weeks to tell anyone what my uncle had said in that kitchen. I told him I hadn't wanted to make a scene. He asked me who taught me that wanting things made a scene. I didn't have an answer that week. I sat with the question for most of April, turning it over the way I'd turn over a file with a number that didn't quite reconcile, certain the discrepancy was in there somewhere if I looked long enough. By our 5th session, I had an answer, and it wasn't a comfortable one. My mother had taught me, without ever meaning to, that being agreeable was the family's love language, and that the fastest way to feel wanted was to need nothing and cost nothing. Gary hadn't invented that dynamic. He'd just been the first person to test how far it would stretch once the person who built it wasn't alive to enforce its limits anymore. Dr. Reyes asked me what I wanted to teach myself instead, going forward, and I told him I wanted to learn the difference between keeping the peace and keeping quiet, because I'd spent 3 decades treating them as the same skill. I had one answer to his original question by the time the wedding came around, and it had nothing to do with scenes at all. Priya drafted a demand letter first, formal, unemotional, citing the specific bequest language from the will and giving my uncle 5 business days to either return the pieces or provide the $61,000 plus the difference between that and fair market value in trust, pending further legal action. I could have sent it quietly, let the lawyers handle it in an office somewhere, no drama, no scene, the version of me that Chloe's text message had described. I didn't do that. I asked Priya one more thing before I called Gary back. I asked her whether a payment already scheduled through a wedding vendor account, drawn from those consignment proceeds, could still be reached or interrupted if it hadn't cleared yet. She told me it depended entirely on timing, and that timing was the one thing entirely in my control. A week before the wedding, Priya called with a complication I hadn't planned for. The consignment shop's records showed Gary had tried to redeem one piece back out of pawn a month earlier, quietly, using cash from somewhere else, only to sell it again days later when that cash ran out. On paper, it looked almost like remorse. In practice, Priya said, it meant a defense attorney could argue he'd intended to make things right all along, that this was a man correcting a mistake, not committing one. It felt, for about a day, like the ground had shifted under the whole case. I sat with that a long time before I understood what it actually meant. He hadn't tried to give the rings back because he regretted taking them. He'd tried to buy himself room to take them again. That was the week I felt something in my chest that I can only describe the way I describe an account under review at work, flagged, held, pending further verification. Every fact I'd trusted about my own family for 30 years needed to be checked again before I could act on it. It ached in a way that had nothing dramatic about it, just a low, steady pressure, like a hold placed on something that used to move freely. I understood, sitting at my kitchen table with Priya's email open in front of me, that I wasn't grieving my mother's jewelry anymore. I was grieving the version of my family I'd spent 34 years auditing in my uncle's favor. 3 days before the wedding, my Uncle Gary called me for the first time since the kitchen. He wanted the date thing settled, meaning he wanted me to confirm I wasn't going to make a scene at Chloe's wedding. I told him I'd already found the consignment forms. There was a long silence on the line, the kind where you can hear someone recalculating everything they assumed about you. "You'll get over it," he said again, quieter this time, like he was trying the sentence on to see if it still fit. "I know," I said. "I already have." He didn't understand what that meant. He would in 3 days. The morning of the wedding, my Aunt Patricia called me, not Gary, which told me they'd already had the fight I imagined they'd have. She said family doesn't do this to family, that Chloe had worked so hard on every detail that I was choosing one afternoon over years of history. I let her finish. Then I asked her a single question. Which years of history exactly did she mean? The years where my mother covered Gary's mortgage twice, or the years where nobody called to ask if I needed help after the funeral? She didn't answer that one either. 2 days later, my Aunt Denise, Patricia's sister, called during her lunch break to tell me she'd always thought of me as the reasonable one in the family, and that reasonable people didn't involve lawyers over a few trinkets. I asked her whether she'd used the word trinkets in front of my mother while she was alive. She hadn't. She didn't have an answer for why she was using it now. The night before the wedding, my cousin Danny, Gary's nephew on his wife's side, texted me the exact phrase Gary had used in the kitchen weeks earlier, word for word, like it had been passed around a family group chat as the official talking point. "Family takes care of family, Elle. Don't ruin this." I saved the message. I had a feeling I'd want it later, and I was right, because it was the same phrase I'd hear again from someone else's mouth in the middle of the reception the very next afternoon.
I went to the wedding. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't to make a scene, and it wasn't, despite what everyone assumed, to embarrass Chloe on her own day. I went because Priya told me the consignment shop's attorney had confirmed the freeze request would process by early afternoon, and because the vendor payment for the florist and the string quartet, the exact line item I'd seen on that misdirected invoice, was scheduled to clear from the same account at 3 o'clock. I went because I wanted to be there, calm, in a blue dress that had been my mother's, when the math finally caught up to the story my family had been telling about me. The marquee tent was exactly as beautiful as the photograph. Orchids hanging in careful clusters, string lights threaded through white linen, a signature cocktail called the Chloe Sunset sweating in tall glasses on a mirrored tray. Somewhere near the dance floor, a quartet was tuning, the same quartet whose invoice I'd seen scheduled against my mother's rings. I found Marcus, of all people, working the champagne table, a second job he hadn't mentioned at the shop, and something in his face when he saw me told me he already understood more than I'd told him. My grandmother Ruth was seated near the front, in a chair someone had clearly chosen for her because it caught the best light for photographs. She caught my eye across the tent and gave me the smallest nod, the same fragile handing-over gesture she'd used on the phone the week before. She didn't say a word to anyone that afternoon. She didn't have to. I understood, watching her watch the room, that she'd already decided which version of this story she believed, long before the card reader ever beeped. Gary found me near the gift table at 2:55. He'd clearly been drinking enough to feel brave and not enough to feel careful. "You came," he said, like it was a concession he was making, not one I was. "I did," I said. "I wanted to see it in person, the wedding my mother's rings paid for." He laughed too loud, the kind of laugh people use to invite a room to laugh with them. A few relatives nearby did. Patricia appeared at his elbow, her smile doing a lot of work. "Not today, Elena, please," she said. At 2:59, the florist's account manager, a woman I'd never met, approached the coordinator's table looking for the final vendor signature to release payment. I watched, from 20 feet away, sipping a glass of water I still hadn't finished, as she pulled out her phone to process it. The card declined. The account manager laughed it off, apologized, tried a second card Gary had handed her from his wallet, the false hope moment, the one where everyone standing nearby assumed a bank had simply hiccuped on a busy Saturday. Gary even joked about it, said something about small-town processors, and for a few seconds the tent settled back into its own noise. Then she tried a third time, the same card, at his insistence, and this time the reader didn't just decline, it printed a paper slip with a hold notice on it, something about the account being flagged pending a legal inquiry. That was the crack. Gary's face did something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of visible unspooling, confidence draining out through the same door his confidence had always come in through, and Patricia's hand went to his arm not to comfort him, but to steady herself. He pulled out his own phone and called the bank directly, right there in front of half the reception, because that's what people do when they still believe the problem is a glitch and not a decision. I heard the hold music through the speaker from where I stood. I heard the representative on the other end explain, patiently, that the account associated with the consignment proceeds had been frozen at the request of counsel representing the estate of Diane Marsh, pending resolution of a beneficiary dispute. My mother's name spoken out loud in the middle of the wedding her rings paid for.
Patricia grabbed his arm. "Gary, what is she talking about?" Not a question, an accusation dressed as one. The florist's account manager, still holding her declined card reader, said, loud enough for the tables nearest the tent to hear, that she'd need a working payment method within the hour, or she'd have to begin breaking down the arrangements before the ceremony even started. That was the moment I'd been building toward without fully admitting it to myself. The one where every clean, boring, procedural step I'd taken finally became visible to the people who told me, for weeks, that I'd get over it. Chloe found her father a few minutes later, her makeup already showing the day's weather. "Dad, what did you do?" she said. And it wasn't rhetorical. She wanted an answer. Gary didn't have one that didn't require admitting what he'd told me in the kitchen. I walked over, not to gloat, though I understood if it looked like that. I walked over because Marcus, still behind the champagne table, caught my eye first, and something about his small, steady nod told me it was time to say the one thing I'd rehearsed since that morning 3 weeks earlier. "Family takes care of family," I said, to all of them, to Gary and Patricia, and the small cluster of relatives who'd gathered near the gift table pretending not to listen. "That's what you told me. I looked into it. It turns out it's true. My mother took care of this family for 30 years. You spent her one last week of it on flowers." Gary's mouth opened and nothing useful came out of it. It was Patricia, of all people, who said the thing that mattered most, the thing I hadn't scripted and couldn't have predicted, the sentence that made the whole ugly year finally make sense out loud. She looked at her husband, not at me, and said, quiet enough for the people closest to hear it, "You told me it was already paid off. You told me none of this would come back." She'd known. Maybe not the details, but enough. And in that moment, hearing her own rationalization repeated back to her by circumstances instead of me, something in her face gave way, the same way a file gives way. Every single signature on it has been checked against the original, and none of them hold up. I've watched that exact moment happen at work, on other people's paperwork, more times than I can count. I never once expected to watch it happen to my own family, in a tent full of orchids, over a phone call to a bank I used to think only I understood. I didn't stay for the collapse. I finished my water, set the glass down on the gift table next to an envelope with my name crossed off the list, and walked back to my car in a blue dress that outlived my mother and, as of that afternoon, outlived a version of me that thought staying quiet was the same thing as staying safe. 3 days after the wedding, my cousin Danny called me, the same one who texted me not to ruin things. He didn't apologize exactly. He said he'd found out, after everything, that Gary had asked him for a small loan the same week he told me the jewelry was already spent, and that he's starting to understand why I'd stopped answering group texts. I told him I appreciated the call. I meant it, mostly. Patricia left Gary 6 weeks later, not because of the wedding she told my aunt on my mother's side, but because it was the first time in 11 years she'd heard him lie to money to someone's face, and realized she'd been hearing smaller versions of the same lie the whole time. Chloe sent me a single text in the months that followed. It said she was sorry that she hadn't known where the money for the wedding actually came from until the account froze in front of her, and that she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again. I believed her, mostly, though I noticed she never once offered to pay any of it back herself, and I've made my peace with the fact that belief and forgiveness aren't the same transaction. We've spoken twice since, both times short, both times careful, the way you talk to someone you might rebuild something with eventually, if the years hold up. I'm not in a hurry to find out.
I also noticed that Gary sent no such message, not once. Not even after the county attorney's office opened its inquiry into the sale, an inquiry that existed entirely because a business had gone under 2 years before any of this happened, and a man had decided someone else's inheritance was the easiest fix available. Danny called me again around the holidays, this time without being asked, and told me Gary was still telling people at family gatherings that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding between siblings that got out of hand. I didn't correct the story to Danny's face. I just sent him the consignment forms, the demand letter, and the freeze notice, dated and time-stamped, and told him he could decide for himself what kind of misunderstanding produces a paper trail like that. He hasn't repeated Gary's version of events since. That part mattered to me more than anything Gary said in that marquee tent. His landscaping company hadn't failed because of a wedding. It had been failing for 2 years. The jewelry wasn't a mistake made under pressure. It was a decision, made calmly by a man who'd already decided long before Chloe got engaged exactly whose things were available to solve his problems. I recovered $41,000 through the consignment shop's bonded insurance, the difference between what my uncle sold the pieces for and what an independent appraiser determined they were actually worth at the time of sale. Priya explained it to me plainly. A bonded dealer carries insurance specifically for situations where an item changes hands under a signature that later turns out to not have the legal authority behind it, and the bond exists precisely so the original owner isn't left absorbing the full loss of someone else's fraud. It took 4 months of paperwork, 2 follow-up calls a week some stretches, and 1 in-person meeting with the shop's attorney where I brought the original appraisal, the will, and the intake form side by side on the same table, the way I'd lay out 3 columns of a reconciliation at work until the numbers either matched or told me exactly where they didn't. I used a portion of the recovered amount to buy back the sapphire pendant itself, still sitting in Marcus's shop's inventory, unsold because he'd quietly flagged it as disputed the same week I first walked in and asked my question at the counter. He told me afterward he did it on instinct, before he'd even confirmed anything, because something about the way I'd described the sale had matched too many other stories he'd heard walk through that same door. I didn't get my father's ring back. It had already been resold to a private buyer before the freeze went through, and Priya told me pursuing it further would cost more in legal fees than the ring itself was worth. I sat with that for a while, in my mother's kitchen, at the same table where Gary had first told me it was already spent. Some things don't come back exactly the way they left, and I've learned to let that be true without letting it undo everything else that did come back. My grandmother Ruth still calls me every Sunday, the way she used to call my mother. She's never once brought up the wedding directly. Last month, she told me, out of nowhere, that family takes care of family, and that she finally figured out what it was supposed to mean all along. Not that you hand over whatever's asked of you, but that you show up, honestly, even when honesty costs a nephew's invitation to Sunday dinner. I think that's the truest thing anyone in my family said that whole year. I still wear the pendant, Not because it undoes anything, because it's the one piece of my mother's that made the whole trip back to me, through a pawn ticket and a pending inquiry and a marquee tent full of people who thought they already knew who I was. Some mornings I still hold it up to the window the way I used to hold up the ring, and it doesn't throw blue across the ceiling the way the ring did, but it catches the light in its own way, and some mornings that's enough. If you take one thing from this, take the boring part, because the boring part is the part that actually works. If someone in your family or your life ever tells you you'll get over it, that's not a prediction, it's a bet. It's a bet that you'll stay quiet enough for the paperwork to disappear, for the story to calcify, for everyone else's convenience to matter more than your own name on a piece of paper. You don't have to scream to collapse that bet. You just have to ask for the receipt and keep asking, calmly, in writing, until somebody has to answer. Here's the part that's actually useful, beyond my family and my particular $130,000. If you're ever the named beneficiary of a specific item in someone's will, a ring, a house, a car, anything itemized by name rather than folded into the general estate, that item is legally yours the moment probate is validated. It is not the executor's to sell, borrow against, or hold indefinitely without your written consent, no matter how many years they've spent being the person everyone trusts with the paperwork. If you ever suspect an executor has moved or sold something that was specifically left to you, two documents matter more than anything else. The first is the original appraisal, dated before the loss, so you can prove value at the time it disappeared, rather than argue about sentimental worth after the fact. The second is any consignment or pawn intake form connected to the item, which by law in most states is available on request to a rightful owner, because it's the exact same mechanism police use to trace stolen property, and it works exactly as well when the person who moved it is your uncle instead of a stranger. A written demand letter from an attorney sent before an asset moves any further downstream can often freeze proceeds at the dealer or bank level faster than most people expect, especially when there's a wedding, a closing date, or any other deadline the other side is racing toward. Timing does almost all of the work. The freeze doesn't need to be loud, and it doesn't need a scene. It just needs to exist on paper before the money moves somewhere you can't reach it anymore. You don't need to be loud to use any of this. You just need to be exact, and you need to start before the story gets told without you in it. If this happened to you, or something close to it, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I promise you, the quiet version of standing up for yourself works better than the loud one ever did.